projects. I'm Tom Poland from Acumen, your host of the webinar today. I'm the Director of Professional Services at Acumen. I'll talk a little bit more about myself in a minute. Let me talk about the relationship between Acumen and Fortier Global. We've been partners since early 2011. In the Australia and Southeast Asia area, Fortier has been a great resource for obtaining Acumen software, for conducting Acumen S1 to S5 risk workshops. What does S1 to S5 mean? We'll talk about that in a minute. And then also local Acumen software training as well. As far as the agenda today goes, we'll be talking a lot about risk. Two aspects. One, the concepts and why at Acumen we've chosen the approach that we have. And then we'll also be doing a fair amount of demonstration of our Acumen risk analysis tool. In fact, for each of these 5 steps listed on the slide, we'll talk about the concepts and why we've implemented these concepts the way that we have. But I think the best part of today's presentation will be where we actually show off Acumen risk. It's been on the market since early October timeframe, and the feedback has been great from 2 types of users. From one, first-time risk analysts who haven't used software before or have used Excel or other rudimentary methods of risk analysis. We've also been getting very positive feedback from analysts and managers who've used other risk software and appreciate the simplicity of the user interface, but the power of Acumen risk as well. So now those 5 areas I have listed here, capturing the uncertainty and sort of calibrating the schedule, identifying risk events, alternate scenarios, interpreting the results, and risk reduction, mitigation plans. And one of my favorite parts of the demonstration is a particular chart we're going to show you, which will effectively show you where your mitigation dollars, time, and energy are best spent. We're going to be showing several examples of these different functionality. And one thing I want to mention now as well, Q&A. We will do Q&A during this session. It's not just one-way broadcast. The way we're going to do questions is through the GoToWebinar control panel. There's an item there on your control panel called questions, and you can simply go into that and expand that if it's not already expanded, and you can type your questions in there. What I'll do is I'll look at those questions at the end. I don't do a very good job of reading questions and presenting at the same time. I'll get lost in my own words. So what I'll do is I'll save those for the end. But I think we have the webinar for 90 minutes, so we should have plenty of time to address many of your questions, if not all of your questions. Okay, so we'll proceed now. I'll start out by talking a little bit about Acumen and what we do and kind of what our priorities are and what we're passionate about. We're squarely focused on project management software. I myself, for about 2 years before coming to Acumen, was a user of the Fuse product. I've been working with project management tools and data analysis for about 17 years now. And when Fuse came along, I really felt like it gave me a very unique and in-depth way to look at project information. My passion for that is actually what led me to Acumen, because we share the same passion. Myself, I've done analytics in the telecommunications, insurance, construction, and defense industries, and now I'm on Acumen's side doing analytics and professional services at Acumen. I've said analytics enough times, but it is something that we're passionate about, and the statement project success requires a sound plan. Can't say it any better than how we feel. We really feel, and we see every day, that if the baseline plan, if that initial plan is of very high quality, we see higher project success. That's not just a claim that we make. That's something we're actually measuring in real time on a daily basis through our benchmarking tool. And I'll be showing you that during the presentation. So Fuse, our first product, helped us understand whether or not we had a sound plan. Our newest product, Acumen Risk, brings risk consideration into the equation. On one of the upcoming slides, we're going to talk a little bit about traditional CPM scheduling and how it's not the final answer when it comes to risk analysis, but it certainly is a very large part of the equation. We have some nice recognition items and some background information here. I won't go through all of these for the sake of time, but we're very proud of some of the recognition we've received. Over here on this same chart, at a very basic level, we have more material on S1 through S5 on our website, and I'll give you that address at the end of the presentation. We have the titles for our S1 to S5, and if you've been in project-oriented environments, I think that they'll make pretty good sense to you. S1, we have the baseline. That's normally what you would do within your scheduling tool. Number two, critiqued, quality. Is this schedule, does it pass some basic checks, and do we feel it's a plan that's going to get us to the finish line? S3, which is where we'll be talking today, is creating the risk-adjusted schedule and going through a structured methodology of building risk into our schedule. It's one thing to go by intuition, and certainly for experienced program managers, intuition can be very valuable. We feel getting the intuition and getting the risk assessment built into the tool gives us a higher quality output in a risk-adjusted schedule. S4, an optimized schedule that's as efficient as possible to get us to the finish line, risk-adjusted, accelerated if needed to meet contractual dates. And finally, S5, a team-aligned schedule that everyone can live with and everyone can commit to. Okay, let's talk about some of the basics of project risk analysis. Scheduling, to be very basic, is, as we say here, the science behind forecasting project completion. And CPM, scheduling tools, are certainly something that we use to forecast a project completion. However, if you're familiar with the equations and formulas and methodology of calculating CPM schedule, it's very rigid. Each activity has a single duration. Each has a single driving relationship for the most part. Leads, lags have fixed values on them. In fact, when you do your calculation in the scheduling tool, it gives you one answer with no variability and no probabilities. And as much as I'd like to say all the schedules that I've worked on have completed on time and under budget, well, they haven't. In fact, very few have. Now, the changes have been dismissed during the course of the schedule as unanticipated events and things that we didn't have control over. And that's true most of the time. However, the things that they could have been thinking about. And looking back, I can't think of too many things that have impacted projects that I've worked on that couldn't have at least been discussed and potentially mitigated beforehand. So scheduling, traditional CPM scheduling helps us understand our overall plan, but those unknowns and those uncertain events, whether it be weather, whether it be problems with the contractual relationship or opportunities within the contract. The fact is, if we don't have them built into our plan in some way, we don't know if our plan is actually reliable. It might look good, but these events can conspire against us and undermine the ability for us to deliver on time. Now, one solution, well, part of the solution to that is project risk registers. And I can say in recent years, virtually every project that I've worked on has had a documented risk register. At Acumen, as we've performed more and more risk workshops, we see companies relying on risk registers, in fact, collaborative risk registers sometimes, to truly understand and communicate risk information on their project. Now, one thing that I haven't seen until I've started to see users adopting Acumen Risk is integrating the risk register with the project plan. Now, I claim to have done that in the past prior to using Acumen Risk. What I was doing is in the schedule, I was creating a field called risk ID, and I was inputting the ID on certain tasks that map to the risk register. There was no mathematics involved, and there was nothing from the risk register that was actually driving the behavior in my schedule, just a text field. Well, we'll show you as part of the demonstration today how we're actually going to link risks in our risk register with items in our schedule and actually have them impact our risk picture in ways that we might not even expect. What do we get out of risk analysis? We gain true insight into schedule achievability. Guess what? That finish date on that last milestone in our CPM schedule might have a 0% chance of actually coming to fruition. When we do the demonstration today, I'm willing to wager that I'll put enough risk into the schedule, just as I'm showing you the different sliders and capabilities that we have, and I think we'll actually take our schedule and show that it has a 0% chance of capability. We pinpoint risk hotspots that will cause delay. We have an incredible chart which will show us specifically what these hotspots are. I've never seen this chart work as well as it does until I use it in Acumen Risk. And overall, we have a structured approach to reducing risk exposure. One of the final things we're going to do in the demonstration today is show how we can trend that reduction over time and see if the mitigation activities that we're putting in place to reduce risk exposure are actually getting us what we expect when we spend time, energy, and money on those mitigation items. And maybe after running the risk analysis, we decide we should mitigate some other items instead of the ones that we're currently spending on. Now let's take the devil's advocate approach and ask the question, why bother with risk analysis? I had the team put together my schedule. I have a good scheduler. We've done projects like this before, and we know our critical path, and we know our issues. Well, those might be true, or we might think those things are true. However, we might have a non-critical path, one that doesn't even approach criticality, which has high risk on it that we haven't discussed and that we haven't built into the project plan. I'm willing to wager, I haven't pulled the statistics on this, but for at least the projects that I've worked on, I can say the critical path at the beginning of the project was not the critical path at the end of the project. Something happened along the way. I say events conspired. Well, the events don't really conspire. It's our inability to sit down, or our unwillingness, I won't say inability, our unwillingness to sit down and do a proper risk exercise, which often can put a project in jeopardy before we even realize that it's going to be in jeopardy. So by addressing risk, we're attempting to bring realism to the table. Realism might change every month. It's not, we can't instantly build realism into our baseline. It's a continuous managed process that we have to follow. We have to manage and really understand our contingency. We're going to be able to show the contingency in Acumen Risk at different confidence levels. We say generates team buy-in to the schedule. To me, it's not the risk analysis itself that generates the team buy-in. It's the overall approach to realism and proactively addressing known unknowns before they happen. That gives everyone a higher confidence level, and it gives the project a higher confidence level of completing on time. Also, when you're performing risk analysis and schedule quality analysis, if you're governed by the need to pass an IPA certification or other types of schedule certification, in the US, for instance, on government projects, we have to pass what we call DCMA certification. Proactively managing quality and risk analysis will help you survive and even thrive in a regulated environment like that. How does it work? What are we actually doing when we talk about risk analysis? We are introducing variability into our schedule and into our forecast. If we're doing this at baseline, our entire schedule is the forecast. I'm going to show you a very easy way, in a very visual way, that we address schedule uncertainty. Because I'll be honest with you, the ways that I've traditionally done risk analysis are not very compelling. They're very numbers oriented, and they're not engaging the team members properly, and therefore the team members aren't giving inputs that reflect the reality of the uncertainty that they're facing. For much of my career, risk analysis has been a process that many individuals have been unwilling to participate in, or just provided cursory participation. By showing that the uncertainty and the risk events are actually going somewhere and being used for a purpose and are very easy to use and manipulate, and you're going to see that this is a very easy tool to use, it's going to engage more people in the risk analysis process. The other thing we're able to look at, whether or not we have a resource and cost loaded schedule, we'll be able to look at the cost impact of time in our schedule and how we can relate those two. The method that we use is a Monte Carlo simulation. We say here it's a brute force approach. There's going to be a series of, by default, 1,000 simulations of our schedule, taking the uncertainty and the risk events into account. Each time that the Monte Carlo simulation is run, different risks are realized. How does the system make these decisions? Well, one, it does it randomly. But two, it does it randomly based on factors that we're going to input into the system. If we think a risk has a very high probability of occurrence, we're going to tell the system that the risk has a high probability. If it's a rare occurrence, we're going to tell the system to have that risk come to fruition in fewer instances of the simulation. Now, one thing that's critical to the Monte Carlo simulation is each time it runs the Monte Carlo simulation, it's doing a full CPM analysis of the schedule. So the schedule logic, the inputs, lags, leads, relationships, constraints in the schedule are critical to be accurate. It's no coincidence we have a picture of a trash can on this screen with two arrows. The expression we often use is garbage in, garbage out. If we don't have a high quality schedule going into the risk analysis process, we're not going to have a high quality risk analysis. This goes back to the S1 to S5 maturity model. If you recall, S2 came before S3. S2 is the schedule quality. S3 is the risk analysis. There's a sequence to that which shouldn't be broken, because if you attempt to do risk analysis before you have a high quality schedule, you'll have a very low quality risk analysis. And here we give you some statistics, and we actually give you the ability in Acumen Fuse to understand and benchmark your own schedule through Acumen Cloud, rather than Acumen Fuse. Through Acumen Cloud, we give you the ability to benchmark your own schedule compared to all other schedules that have been submitted to Acumen Cloud. So in this example, I have a Fuse schedule index of 72 out of 100. It's put me in the 80th percentile of schedules submitted, which is pretty good. And it's given me a 73% probability of project success based on these quality metrics over towards the right-hand side of the screen. My goal before going into a risk exercise is to maximize this score. It's telling me my percentile is green, but it's telling me my score is yellow. I want to know going into my risk exercise that from a quality standpoint, my schedule is green. Therefore, going into the risk exercise, I'm going to have a higher probability of success. And by virtue of the fact that I'm going to do risk analysis, I have an even higher probability of success than this. Let's talk briefly about some alternative approaches to building a risk model. There's some pros, but there's some cons as well. The first, over on the left-hand side, would be to risk load the critical path. It makes sense, right? We create a schedule baseline, we run the critical path, and we know that that's the path that can potentially hurt us the most. Well, we really don't know that. We're making an assumption that the critical path at the start of the project is going to be the critical path at the end of the project, which personally I know isn't often the case. In general, it's a dangerous approach, and by not assessing the entire schedule for risk, those known unknowns or unknown unknowns can very quickly become critical and undermine the risk load on the critical path that you've done at the start of the project. You'll have to get back together, look at the new critical path, and do a similar risk exercise while the program's in the execution phase. I don't like that for two reasons. One, I think it's too late in the game to do that. And two, next week, that path might not be critical anymore. So to this first one, I say, why not have all your bases covered? Why give yourself blinders just by looking at today's critical path? The second item, which is quite popular in the industry, is to create a summary schedule. It simplifies a very large project schedule into maybe just a couple hundred lines. It's easy for everyone to get together into a risk workshop and understand those 200 lines in the schedule and make assumptions based on them. However, what you're doing is you're potentially or probably undermining the fact that you have a CPM schedule sitting on the side that's not summarized, that contains the real information on how to execute your project. It contains the logic, the calendars, the schedule detail, even soft constraints, lags, leads, everything that you need to get from point A to point B on the project. In accounting, they might call that a second set of books per se. I'm not suggesting fraudulent behavior or anything like that. The finish dates might be the same, and the summary schedule might very well represent the detailed schedule. However, without the fidelity to be able to do that forward and backward pass in the CPM model, in a risk-adjusted CPM model, you might be creating some blind spots for yourself. What we'll show you with Acumen Risk is you can have your cake and eat it too. I'm going to show you some methods where I adjust uncertainty in the schedule, even on a very large schedule, very quickly, and then also the way I'm able to map risks to the detailed level of my schedule eliminates the need to use either one of these methods, because we're going to be able to create a risk-adjusted schedule in the same amount of time, if not quicker, than employing these other methods. The start of our approach is the uncertainty factor. We have a screenshot on the right. Rest assured, I'm going to show you how this actually works in the tool. Screenshots are nice, but there's no substitute for a live demonstration. In this graphical approach, we're using the true schedule. And as I mentioned, I'm going to show you a very unique way we can provide the duration uncertainty of the system from the top down, which is very quick, but then also work at the lowest level of detail that we need to. This creates a fast approach. I'm able to explain these sliders to someone without risk management experience, usually in under 30 seconds. In fact, users that I've seen have enjoyed using the tool and moving the sliders instead of the traditional 10-key 3-point estimate entry that we've done in the past. Now, colors and sliders are nice, but what I'm also going to show you in a moment is what defines the sliders. I'm very skeptical by my nature, so the first time I saw the sliders, I was impressed, but my question immediately was, how do these sliders work? And this is the screen that I was shown, the uncertainty factor editor, where we can conform the way that Acumen Risk works to meet a risk process that you've already had in place. What we're able to effectively do is take the risk process that you have now, build it into Acumen Risk, so that you're doing the same things that you're doing now and getting many of the same outputs, hopefully even more, while not having to change your underlying process. I don't believe that software drives process. I believe process drives software, and that's why we've given you this flexibility in Acumen Risk. Now, there's going to be people who have risk experience who say, I like the old way of doing this with the minimum, most likely, and maximum estimates for each activity. And in a moment here, I'm going to show you exactly how I'm doing that, but I'm doing it in a much simpler way than having to key those in for every task in the schedule. So let me switch over to the software, and I'm going to open a project. It's called Initial Plan. I'm going to import it into the tool. I'm here in the entire Acumen environment, and I can move seamlessly between the different tabs. You can see the benchmarking is there. I can do my quality assessment on the diagnostic screen. Today we're talking about Acumen Risk, so I'm going to go to S3 Risk. And here's my plan. In fact, I can expand my project plan according to the WBS, or in fact, I can group it by any other field that I have in the schedule. I'll stick with the WBS for today. And here's those duration uncertainty sliders. They're certainly attractive. I can explain to someone very quickly that if they move this slider to the green area, they're telling the system that this activity has been estimated at a very conservative level. In fact, the activity may be able to be conducted in a shorter amount of time than originally estimated. Conservative, realistic. Now I go to the red side. This is where I'm telling the system this activity might have been planned a bit aggressively, and we need to factor that into the risk estimates. And finally, we can go to very aggressive. Now, one thing that you didn't see as I was doing that is as I move these sliders, it's creating my minimum, most likely, and maximum duration for each of these activities. In fact, when I did it here, I was collapsed. It was doing it for these activities as well. And you can see by working at the summary level, I need to expand this one. You can see when working at the summary level, I can very quickly rate the duration uncertainty for my entire schedule. Same rules apply as always. I need to have the right people in the room, and I need the person responsible for the work to be making the decision. And I need them to understand what risk analysis is. But like I said, a good introduction to that for people who haven't done this before are these sliders. Because if there's one thing that most people involved with project management understand, is the difference between red, yellow, and green. In this case, red means that I have a higher risk activity, and these numbers have been adjusted accordingly. Now, I said earlier, I'm very skeptical. I also like the tool to be able to conform to your process, not my process. And that's where I have the uncertainty template. In this template, I can determine the number of choices that the manager has when they're evaluating the duration uncertainty for their activity. Within that, I can also modify the titles to suit terminology that we might use or that you might use in your organization. Additionally, I can change the distribution type. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, I can change for my organization what minimum, most likely, and maximum percentages mean for each of these items. So when they say realistic, if I have most likely, or I'm sorry, very conservative, and they select most likely, it's going to take 105% of the original duration that they've entered, not 100%. So I can change that for each of these three values. So although in the example, I move the duration uncertainty sliders first, in reality, the first place I would go in Acumen Risk is to the uncertainty factor editor. Once I go through this exercise, and I have these the way that I want them, I can save this as a template for future projects. I don't want you to have to do this exercise every time you have a new project. If you have a committed risk analysis process and you have determined values for each of these items, I don't want you to have to do the same work again. So you get to save these as a template. Oh, finally, let's just, because we can't, oh, it wants me to save here. This workbook 2. Finally, let's take those uncertainty values only. And there we go. Run the Monte Carlo simulation. Let me go up to the top. And we're already getting some answers. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and talk a little bit more about what we have here. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that on the PowerPoint. I'm actually going to talk about that here. What we have is a deterministic finish date of 97%. Well, I didn't apply enough risk uncertainty to meet my goal of showing you 0%. I've actually shown you a very likely schedule. But it doesn't matter. The concept is the same. It's giving me a best case date of December 18th, 2012. It's giving me a 50% probability of January 16th, 2013, 75% probability of January 21st, and a worst case of February 8th, 2013. Range of 52 days. The range risk factor, which is the range divided by the remaining duration, is 5%. Okay, So we've captured some uncertainty information. We've had all of our staff go through and adjust these sliders. Let me create a higher risk scenario just because we can. Because there's a couple more things I'll show you on this screen, and then we'll start looking at our risk register. So I've moved these sliders further to the right, so I'm expecting my deterministic confidence to go down. Let's see what actually happens. It has. It's gone down to 0%. And you can see it's showing me best case and P50, P75 dates that are further out in the future than we had before. We have a higher range in days, and we also therefore have a higher risk range factor of our range divided by our remaining duration. Okay, let's talk about capturing risks in our risk register. Okay, this is different than duration uncertainty. This is a little different than moving those sliders around. There's a little more going on because we have a risk register which has information of its own that we're maintaining. These aren't the activities in the schedule. These are separate risks documented in a separate area of acumen risk, which may have impact to our scheduled activities. But you can see there's some red, yellow, and green out here as well. So we're going to be doing an assessment on our risks. In fact, the system is going to be doing an assessment of our risks based on the input parameters that we assign to them. Those input parameters are the probability of occurrence, and then if the risk does occur, what the impact will bring to our schedule. We support both threats and opportunities. I've seen a lot of risk registers. In fact, I'm going to use a risk register today that only has risks on it. Now, I guess that's not a very good advertisement for opportunity management, but it's another essential part of risk management because your opportunities, just like your mitigation plans for your risks, can help mitigate risk and help you still meet your committed project end date. Within acumen risk, we have a few different states of risks, and consequently, we have a couple different ways to run our Monte Carlo simulation. We have our current risks, which is what's in our risk register, but in the demonstration, I'm going to show you what's over to the right here as well in this mitigation area. And we'll be able to show you very directly what the impact those mitigation plans will have. In fact, you can do that before you even start mitigation so that you know if your mitigation dollars are actually going to buy you what you expected from your schedule. Let's talk about calibrating the risk register. Very important step. And again, like with the template that I showed you previously for the uncertainty, I'll show you this screen live in the demonstration as well, but just conceptually here, we start with a 5x5 standard probability and impact matrix, but we give you capability up to 9x9, or as little as 3x3. I've worked in different organizations that have different sensitivity to the colors red, yellow, and green. I'll be able to show you how we can very quickly and dynamically rescore the colors of our risks so that we're showing more red in a more urgent situation, or we're showing less red. We also, as far as impacts are concerned, we'll be able to show the impacts either based on real days and real dollars or percentages of the baseline amounts, the original amounts. We can rescore the template. Right now we have a scale to 1 to 25. That can be a scale from 1 to 100. It could be a scale of 50 to 100, anything that you define. And finally, for each risk, we're able to assign custom fields. We realize that different users have different processes and different needs when it comes to documenting a risk. So one that we have out of the box that we suggest is owner. I've seen other users use location, department, and even key decision date point for a risk as well. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's more to managing risk than having a risk register. I mentioned earlier that I was simply going to a text field in my schedule and typing in the risk ID, and it really wasn't doing anything for me from a calculation perspective. We've gone well beyond that with Acumen Risk. We have the ability to directly link the scheduled tasks to the risk register and have the probability and impact of those risks drive the schedule during the various runs of the Monte Carlo simulation. So right now, we've only run the simulation based on uncertainty. Once I pull in this risk register and map risks, we're going to have two strikes against us. In fact, our schedule, I can tell you right now, isn't going to recover from the 0% confidence, because once we add these risks, the high probability risks are going to occur more often through our Monte Carlo simulations. Our low probability risks are going to occur sometimes. When they do occur, the system's going to look at the impact that we've coded in for the risks, and it's actually going to affect the scheduled durations. Now, we do more than one Monte Carlo run. In fact, so far I've been running 1,000. So some of those scenarios are going to be very long and extended scenarios, and others are going to be shorter. And that's where that histogram comes in. I didn't spend much time on the histogram. I'm going to show you a few different charts, but we're going to do those once I pull some risk into the schedule. In fact, I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so here we are back in Acumen Risk. And here's that probability distribution and the S-curve before we've pulled any risk into the equation. I'm going to click this button here to add this to a risk comparison. We're going to do that in a little while. We're actually going to look at that risk comparison in a little while. I'm going to compare my duration uncertainty Monte Carlo simulation to one that includes risk, and then finally one that includes mitigation plans. Let's look at our risk register. I have this two-panel design here where I can control what's on the left and right-hand panel of my screen. But right now, I'm actually going to go full screen with the risk register to show you the different components. Now, rather than me sit here and type in about 24 risks, I have an import capability where I'm going to import a file called populated risk register that I've already prepared. In fact, this sample risk register that's coded in Excel comes with every copy of Acumen Risk, so that if you're using a risk management tool right now, you can do some Excel, conform it to the format, and import it right here into Acumen Risk. As I mentioned, I have a risk ID. Here's the threat and opportunity. You can see I have all threats, which doesn't bode well for our risk simulation. We have a name for each risk, and for each we've assigned a probability of occurrence. This one happens to be very high. Schedule impact, very high, which in this case is approximately 50 days. Very high cost impact, hence the score. If you recall on our template, and I have that template available right here, that's my worst case scenario. As I mentioned before, I can adjust my tolerance for different colors if I choose. I can adjust the size of my matrix and go up from 5 by 5 or go down to 3 by 3. I can determine if my impacts are going to be percentage-based or schedule-based. One thing I should mention is I can go in and change any one of these values. I can auto-score and auto-range based on Acumen Risk's interpretation of the information in my schedule. I can change these scores. As I mentioned earlier, I could go on from a scale of 50 to 100. I can simply overtype these values. I can create an asymmetrical matrix, like I've done here. In fact, you can see if you have a sharp eye, you might see some of those colors changing in the background as I change these scores. It's all done in real time. Finally, down here are the custom fields for my risk register, which I can overtype and then enable within the software. So let's go back to our risk register. You can see I have, I don't know, approximately 20 risks in the system. And as I mentioned, I can map these to activities in my schedule. And let's do that now. So let me change my left panel back to my activities. And my right panel will be my risk register. Now, when I did the import, this column opened up, and you can see that there's a color there. And if I drill down, what I'll find is that when I did my import, some of these activities are already mapped to some risks. In fact, this summary activity is linked to risk 9, which has also created a relationship between risk 9 and every activity underneath this summary. Now, because it's mapped to a summary, it's apportioned the risk impact among the activities. Each of these activities isn't going to take the full impact of the risk. The impact is going to be apportioned based on the remaining duration. Now, if I'd like, I don't have any risks mapped up here. I can take either one of these individual tasks, or I can take the summary, and I can go here to the risk register, and I can start creating relationships. And you can see these colors immediately changed. And if I have a high-risk scenario and detailed design can be affected by a number of risks, I can simply continue clicking down these checkboxes to add additional risk impact. Now, I've just caused some problems here. They're not bad problems if this is the reality of the situation. Of course, this is a demonstration, so there is no reality. But I've mapped this summary task to a high probability of occurrence, high impact. This one's low, so it's not going to cause too much damage. This one's medium. And as the simulation runs, 1, 2, or even all of these risks, depending on which round of the simulation, these might all come to bear. And detailed design in some cases might stretch out immensely and cause significant impact, and it might become a critical activity if it wasn't critical prior to this risk exercise. This is exactly where the rubber meets the road on those non-critical paths becoming critical. So just as the quality of the schedule was important to enter in this phase, the mapping between the scheduled tasks and the risk is vital to be accurate. This should be discussed and discussed again, just to be sure that these relationships are in place. Because if I'm missing one of these relationships and detailed design is not impacted by a high probability, high impact risk that it should be impacted by, the relationship won't be established. Just as with critical path scheduling, if two tasks don't have a predecessor-successor relationship between the two of them, they're not going to be related, and they're not going to be on the same critical path in the schedule. It's the same concept, but it's applied to risks and activities rather than just two activities in the schedule. Well, let me go on with it here and run the Monte Carlo simulation. I'm going to look at a couple settings first, because I want to make sure when I run the Monte Carlo simulation that it's going to take risk events into account. And I do that here under scenarios. This is the default option, and I like that this is the default option. It's going to take the results from those uncertainty sliders that we moved earlier. Now it's also going to take the impact of our risk event mapping, but without mitigation. If you remember earlier, I said we were going to run this 3 times. Once with uncertainty, once with risk events, and then again with mitigation. So we're going to do our second run right now. It's very quickly running 1,000 iterations, taking the risks into account. I'm going to add this to my risk comparison for later. And I don't know if you remember these dates from before, but they were earlier before. In fact, my curve was shaped a little bit differently. My curve was a little more optimistic before. One question I get asked a lot, 2 questions actually, are, one, that's nice that you've given me a P50 and a P75 value, but our process calls for an 80% confidence level, and I don't see that here on your chart. Well, it's very simple. I can go to the 80% and I can add the p-value, and now in my table down here I have a p80 value. The next question I get is, how much contingency do I need in my schedule to get to my p80 date, to get myself confident in my p80 date? And I can answer that. I need 131 days. If I had done this before I'd taken the tangible risks into account, and just done this on the uncertainty, this number would have been lower. But taking that uncertainty and taking the mapped risks into account, at the top level of the project, I need 131 days of contingency. Now, I said the project. What if I want to work with an individual technical manager and just look at detailed design? I can simply click on detailed design. I get a whole different profile tied specifically to the detailed design tasks. I get all my same information, including that contingency and that P80 value that I added to the chart. I can give in all my risk range factor and all my other items. I can give each one of these summary task owners confidence, or maybe even a lack of confidence if the numbers don't come out that well, like they have here. I've got to tell this individual that they only have a 1% chance of meeting their deterministic finish date. But the important thing to mention is I can work with each one of them individually as part of a risk exercise and show them information that's tailored to their activities and their execution process. It's great to show the top level to the project manager, but if we're going to mitigate risk on this project, it's going to happen one area at a time. So I can show the detailed information. Now, we're at a crossroads here because we can see we have a very high risk schedule. We have a very low chance of meeting our deterministic schedule. So we're going to need to determine where we are going to perform mitigation steps. I'm going to go to the risk drivers. These are the risks that are causing me harm as part of my risk exercise. I'm showing you at P50. I can show you this at any confidence value. For the first time, we have a tornado chart, which is not only showing me how each risk impacts my schedule, but it's showing me by activity, and it's showing me in the number of days. So now, when I need to work with a program manager and put mitigation plans in place, we can assure that we're looking at the right risks to spend the money on. This orange risk down here only has a few days of impact on these tasks. There's some much greater risks in the schedule. And I can do this for all my functional areas. This area has no mapped risks. It's just affected by uncertainty. And here's the impacts of the uncertainty. I'm going to come back to this chart in a few minutes. I have a few other concepts I want to talk about. We're going to come back to this chart, and then we're going to add those mitigation steps that I talked about, and we're going to see if our situation improves any once we put some mitigation in place. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. I think I've covered some of these items, but let's make sure I didn't miss anything. Let's talk about some of these Monte Carlo options and the simulation itself. Counts for all reasonable combinations of risk and uncertainty. It stays within the parameters that you've defined, which again is why the computer can't do this by itself. It needs your inputs. It needs you to move the uncertainty sliders. It needs you to profile your risks and the probability and rate the impacts as well. And of course, to take a step back, it needs you to set up that matrix, that template beforehand. We have some good smart default options in there, but to do this right, we want to conform to a risk process that you may already have in place. When it runs the simulation and it takes the uncertainty and it takes the risks into account, it doesn't undermine CPM schedule logic. As I mentioned earlier, each one of those iterations is a full CPM forward and backward pass. And that's what gets you to the probability histogram, where the longer bars, the longer vertical bars, those dates occurred more often than the extremes of that bell curve. One thing that you'll find, and we've talked about this 2 or 3 times now, is based on uncertainty and mapping to risk, your critical path may jump to a path that you didn't expect. We also recommend you run enough iterations until your results don't vary significantly. The system can help you do that. Fairly quickly, I pulled up those Monte Carlo options because there are a lot of them. And most of the time you can leave the defaults. But you can have the system, especially if you have a very large schedule, it will continue running simulations until it converges on an accuracy factor. It'll keep running until it's finding that the answers don't vary more than 1% from one another. And at that point, it says that you're done. Or you can change that to 5%, or you can change that to 10%. We've talked about these scenarios, whether or not you're taking risk into account. The interaction with the tool, you can have it actually go through each iteration interactively so you can see the results along the way. You have additional options to seed the random number generator to repeat the same results, and you can use correlation as well. Now, I already showed you within the tool what some of these items mean, so I'll review this very quickly. We showed you the different confidence levels, P50 for instance. That means I'm 50% confident based on the risk simulation in this example that will finish on February 19th. We added the P80, which means we're 80% confident we'll finish on that date. Contingency, how much more or less time do I need to finish by that date? In our case, we needed more time. We didn't need less time. Confidence level, that's our deterministic. I think we started with 97%, we got ours down to 0%. In this example, they have a 3% of finishing on the date of the actual finish milestone in the schedule. And then finally, we have the risk range factor. As I mentioned, it's the range, which is really the difference between these two dates in your histogram and the total remaining duration of the project. Risk drivers, this is kind of where we got to in the simulation. And this is why I wanted to take a step back and talk about kind of the what and the why a little bit before I change this chart around and show you something that I think is just awesome. The goal with the risk drivers tornado, I love looking at it, but here's what it means. These are the highest risk activities. We have them sorted for you, and we have them listed by number of days of impact. These are the events that can potentially cause you the most pain. And in the Monte Carlo simulation, let me get rid of potentially. As it ran the Monte Carlo simulation, these are the risks that caused you the most pain. These are the items that if it's possible to mitigate, you're going to want to mitigate first. Because when you mitigate these first, you're going to get the most time and most money back in your schedule. Traditional reporting is percentage-based, which told you the level of magnitude, but didn't give you the number of days like we give you here. Traditional reporting is based on this formula. I don't understand this formula, but I know how to read this chart. Finally, the risk contribution factor as well. True measure of impact and duration of cost helps you differentiate between uncertainty in the green and then the risks, which are color-coded according to the legend down below. For the first time, you're going to know how those 3-point estimates are impacting your scheduled activities, in addition to knowing how your documented risks by days are impacting your activities. But I'm going to throw another wrinkle into the equation here. Let me make this a little bit larger. Right now, we have risk impact by activity. Let's turn this table on its side. Now we click in activity. Let me click one that has risks associated with it. Let me find a good picture here, or we'll go back to the original. Okay, this one's as good as any other. There's only one. We now have the risk down the left-hand side and how it's impacting these different tasks under the summary level that I've clicked on. So before I showed you how risks are impacting my schedule. Now I'm showing you per risk which activities it's affecting. I like using both methods to get a true understanding, and I'll go over back to the top level here to show you some more information, but another example and one that has multiple items. So at the top program level, in order of impact, I have the risks. And then, instead of a solid bar, I have the next level of information down. I have the activities that are being most affected by that risk. I can see where the pain is coming if I don't put mitigation plans in place, and I can see the level of magnitude, and I can see that impact in days. Now, mitigation planning becomes informed decision making. I like intuition. I like when the program manager uses experience. I can combine that experience with tangible information that I can show them. It might surprise them. It might confirm what they know. It might do both, depending on how many risks that there are. But it's more information, and it's solid, tangible information based on the inputs that we've given to the system, assuming we've gone in with a high-quality schedule. Okay, so we've done some analysis. We've come up with some priorities for mitigation. Before I showed you the risk register, I'll show it to you again to remind you of how these mitigation plans work. For each risk, I have the option to check the checkbox and let the system know that mitigation is an active activity ongoing for that risk. I get to describe the mitigation behavior, what we're doing to mitigate the risk. Optionally, I can decide the cost and time that it will take us to mitigate that risk. And I get to assign a new profile, and the system's going to give me a new score. This risk, if mitigated, will go from 50 to 20. It's still red, but it's not as red. This risk will go from a score of 50 to a score of 5. There's a real opportunity here. And I think I have a few others. So to this point, let me set my screen up here. If I did everything right earlier, I have 2 lines on my risk comparison, and I do. I'm gonna name these because we're gonna use these again for mitigation. The first, the red line, is uncertainty only. The blue is when we took risks into account. And risk. We're gonna add a third line. We're gonna add a third S-curve. And what I'm really hoping, my fingers are crossed, that when we run the simulation with some mitigation plans in place, we're going to get a third line to the left of the blue uncertainty and risk line. And what that'll represent is a probable finish date at all these confidence levels occurring earlier in time. On this chart, left is good if we want to finish earlier. So we want to see a line that moves to the left. I can track this month over month, risk over risk. If we add new risks next month and we add new mitigation plans, I can add a new line. When I have too many lines on the chart, I can use the X to retire some of them. I can keep this ongoing as a living comparison as I execute on my project to see how my risk profile is changing. This is further proof, as organizations use these trend lines, that risk management shouldn't be treated as a one-time event during project baseline. It's an ongoing living part of project execution, and the trends will show you which direction you're going in. Like I said, we want to see things move to the left. So let's go ahead and run a Monte Carlo simulation. Let me go back to my histogram, but we're going to run it differently this time. We're going to choose the third option, where we take mitigation into account. So let's run our risk analysis. Cross your fingers. I can tell right away this S-curve moved to the left a little bit, my histogram changed a little bit. So I'm still not happy because my deterministic data is still 0%, but let's add this to the risk comparison and let's see where we got. We've done it. Well, we haven't solved it completely, but when I say we've done it, we mean I've moved to the left a little bit. This project has a higher probability of finishing earlier based on the mitigation events that we've added to the risk register. Let's add another label here. If we continue mitigating and our mitigation plans are real and our mitigation overhead doesn't get out of control, we're going to be able to get this green line at least over to where our red line is. And I'll tell you what, if we really maintain that risk matrix week by week, month by month, we have the money, the time, the energy, and the willingness to look at opportunities, it's even possible for us to once again meet our deterministic finish date and get ourselves to the left of our uncertainty only line. Only with commitment to the process, use of a good tool, of course, always helps, and the ongoing desire to improve, the ongoing desire to be skeptical about the initial duration uncertainty estimates and see if there's opportunities to move these to the green. The ongoing desire to catalog more risks, but mitigate them and seek opportunities as well. And you'll see this trend chart improve as we've done now, just even in this short exercise, albeit with demo information. It doesn't happen quite this quickly in real life, but you know what? We try to keep the tool out of the way and help things work as quickly as possible for you. Even in a demonstration with other risk tools and processes that I've used, I wouldn't have been able to do what I've done so far today nearly as quickly as I have. There's one more concept I want to talk about before we go into questions and answers. We talked about the benefit of mitigation. Oh, one thing I failed to mention, I can show the difference in days between any two of these lines. I can go from uncertainty and risk to with mitigation. I can do that at any confidence level. I did mine at 60% here. And it'll show me how many days I bought myself with mitigation. And that's great to be able to say, it will cost us $5 million to finish 27 days earlier. If that's not important, don't spend the $5 million. If that 27 days keeps things on track and keeps our company in business and in good graces with our customer, and $5 million is worth it, spend the $5 million and get the 27 days. The tool will help you make that decision. We talked about scenarios. As I mentioned, you can keep this live over time. Okay, let's talk about something that I mentioned earlier. I'll do this briefly. We have the ability to connect an Excel-based cost model with any schedule that you have. When I say any schedule that you have, I mean it. You don't need a resource or cost-loaded schedule to begin this process or to finish this process or do anything in the middle of this process. We believe anyone should be able to take a cost-risk distribution like we represent here. I'm going to show you one in Excel. Take the schedule that we're already performing schedule-based risk on and show the schedule impact on the cost-risk distribution, which effectively, once we add uncertainty to this cost-risk distribution, this is a good visual here. It's going to flatten our pyramid. It's going to increase our range of answers. So let me show you how to get started with that. I have a file available. It comes with every copy of, oh, I think I have it in my file history. It comes with every copy of Acumen Risk, and it's what we look at as a representative cost risk model. Now, all the information that you see on the screen here doesn't need to be populated. Some is critical, like the ID, the WBS, the description. Those are definitely good starting points. This remaining cost is critical. In here, in our import file, I happen to have a minimum, most likely, and maximum cost. But I'll be able to overwrite these with my sliders based on the remaining duration that I have in place today. Or I can choose to keep these values. So if you've been doing cost uncertainty work right now, and you decide to adopt Acumen Risk, you can build upon your existing work. You don't need to throw everything away. Let me move over to Acumen Risk and actually import this file. I'm going to go to the Projects tab. This is where I initially imported my file. I go to this standard Excel file import, and I have it out here called Sample Cost Risk. I'm going to tell it to build my WBS hierarchy based on the information that's coded in the WBS field in the Excel file. Once I click Import, I'm ready to go. I go back over to Acumen Risk. It's telling me that I have two files now, Initial Plan, but then also this one called Cost Risk Sheet. This should look very familiar to you, with one exception. There used to be days here. Now there's dollars. I have an uncertainty template. I have a risk matrix template. I have my sliders. I'm in my comfort zone with Acumen Risk. If I've done it for schedule, I can do it for cost. I can move these individually. I can move these from the top level down. Same flexibility that I had before with duration. Now I can do it with cost. Right now, these exist as two separate entities. The schedule that I was working with before and the cost model that I have now. Some sharp-eyed viewers may have noticed that there's a new column here. This is the cost schedule overlay column. This allows me to take an item in my cost matrix. I'm going to click this, and I'm going to map this to any item in my schedule. I want to map it to an item that makes sense. This is demonstration data. I have the freedom to map it anywhere. I can map to a summary level. I can map to a detailed level. It's all up to me, and I don't need any coding from either the schedule or the cost model that previously relates the two. I'm doing that mapping right now. One way to look at it is I'm cost loading my schedule right now for the purposes of risk analysis. Now, when I run a Monte Carlo simulation on this cost model, it's going to take the schedule uncertainty from these two items into account. I've got my histogram as I had before, but you may notice a key difference. I have dollars now. I can move seamlessly back and forth between my schedule and my cost model and make adjustments. And when I'm ready to see my schedule impact, I run the Monte Carlo simulation with my schedule project open. When I want to see the cost impact of schedule and I've done my mapping between the two, I refresh my overlay and I run my risk analysis as I've just done. And I'll see the schedule impact to my cost information. We don't believe schedule and cost happen in a vacuum. We see one drive the other. We see it every day. We give you the ability to do that and to connect the dots, to give you a full integrated cost and schedule risk model. My slide here simply reflects what I've already shown you, is how we've created that mapping between the two. So to recap, what we've done today is we started out with just the uncertainty sliders, and we got ourselves to a Monte Carlo simulation very quickly, even before we had cataloged and organized our risk events. We added our risk events, but we didn't just keep them in a risk register. We mapped them to very specific activities. From there, we did a risk analysis, and we saw which the big drivers were. And if we were doing a real risk exercise, we would have used that chart to determine, exactly where to start mitigating. As it was, I had some mitigation plans already in place, so we ran the simulation with those mitigation events. And we saw that there was a benefit to mitigation as we went. And we were able to measure that as time moves forward and as we continue mitigating. Finally, we took the cost model, we mapped it to the schedule, and we took full account for the fact that as our schedule is delayed, our costs are going to increase. And we did it in a method that does not require resource and cost-loaded schedules going into the exercise. Here's where you can find more information. Our website, you can get a trial of any one of our 3 software products. You can find us on Twitter, and you can email us at info@projectacumen.com with any questions. Speaking of questions, I'm going to go over to the questions queue now and see if there's anything in there. I do see a couple. Can you show the contingency in dollars? Yes, let me get my mouse back over here. Hold on. Oh, I almost tried to leave the webinar. Hang on. Okay. Yes. The contingency, I can show add a p-value, and I can show the contingency at any one of those confidence levels. So at 80%, contingency is 0.44 billion. That was a question from Robert. Question is probabilistic branching. Is probabilistic branching available? We implement probabilistic branching differently than some of the other tools that you might be familiar with. Philosophically, we believe in using risks to impact activities and different paths of activities. So if I had a branch in the schedule that was very short in duration, but could become very large in duration if events conspire against it, I can map those activities to a very high risk item in my risk register. Another tool I have at my disposal that I don't normally show off, but I think it's a good related topic is, let me go back over to the schedule actually. I have a field called the existence percentage. I prefer to map to risks, but I also have the ability to tell the system that I have a very slight chance of a series of activities coming to bear. Meaning, if I put this activity existence down to 10%, in only 10% of the Monte Carlo runs will this activity exist in the plan. So I have a few ways to conditionally affect different branches of activities. Can you show the data information in day, month, year format? Yes, we have a, I don't do that very often, but we have, it's either in the Fuse options, or it is, there's a long date format here. I think it's, I guess, in options on the project screen. I've just done it in the past few days. Display settings, there's currency symbol. I know it's here in one of these two places. I'm just not seeing it. I probably actually had it up on the screen at some point. If Robert, if you send us an email, I'll send you that information back on how to switch the data around. I'm just not seeing it right now, but I know it's in here. Send us an email. I'll get back to you. Many more questions coming in. Can you show the key drivers in dollars? Yes, everything that I've done on the, I don't have a risk matrix loaded in for my cost. It should show me something with my uncertainty. If I had specific cost risks loaded in to my cost model, I would see the risk breakdown here as well, in addition to the uncertainty. Robert likes existence. He says that's sweet. Thank you, Robert. Does existing risk analysis against activities in P6 schedule affect risk level and acumen when importing? Yes, if you go to the Fields tab, you can map Primavera fields, standard user-defining code fields, into minimum most likely estimates that feed directly into acumen risk. Here's max duration, minimum duration. So not only P6, but if you have an existing risk model that's either in Excel, or if you're using Microsoft Project and just have that information in the number 1, 2, and 3 fields like I used to, you can import that information into the environment. Difference between existence and probability. Let's call existence probability of occurrence. Does Acumen show cash flow and earned value? Yes. In the diagnostics tab, let me go over here. In the diagnostics tab, I have hundreds of metrics. One of the metrics group is earned value metrics. Frankly, I'm not sure what I have loaded into this demo schedule in terms of earned value. Really not much, really just some budgets and forecasts. But I've got that information available. Obviously, if I've loaded it up front in my system. Let's see, let me find a few more here. Do the P50 dates import seamlessly back into P6? Yes, as you're, and this is a capability that I'll mention as well. This is a question from Vincent. As I'm creating those different scenarios and adding P80 values in Acumen and Risk, et cetera, it's actually creating P50, P80. As I added P80, it's creating values and dates in fields that it's creating. You can build a risk-adjusted schedule using this capability, and then you can export that schedule back into Primavera so that you have a Primavera model that has the risk exercise baked into it. So if you've done your risk exercise to the point where you're extremely satisfied with the results and that's going to become your working plan, without having to go in Primavera and duplicate everything that you've done in Acumen Risk, you can simply create the Primavera file with the risk impacts in it. Let's see, let me find some other quick questions here. Any that I don't get to, the queue's really filling up here with a lot of questions. Anything that I don't get to, please send us to, I'll put that email address back up on the screen, and in a moment here, is there a mitigation comparison tool to show the biggest potential of mitigation for the least cost? What you would do, that's a good question. Let's see, off the top of my head here, you would have to look at your risk drivers and then come up with the mitigation plans that obviously can meet your budget. And what you could do then is you could build your first mitigation. You could do that based on scenarios. You can build in your first mitigation plan, run your Monte Carlo simulation with mitigated, and then create that S-curve that we did earlier. I could go back into the risk register. I could undo or uncheck the first mitigation plan and put in a second mitigation scenario, which might be mitigating one risk or a series of risks, and add another bar, and then check the difference between the two, so that I can see strategically, and I can show the program manager, hey, scenario one, where we mitigated this way, gets us further over to the left than the other scenarios. And I do that, and I know that information just by continuing to add S-curves here within reason, continuing to add S-curves to see how my mitigation plans are turning out in terms of the real results of the simulation. Can I save the new risk-affected schedule XER and re-import back to P6? Yes, both for P6 and for Microsoft Project. Weather modeling, give us about to the middle of March on weather modeling. We have a whole pack of features coming to Acumen Risk. We'll be doing seminars at that time once those features are out, but weather modeling is one of them, and we're doing it in kind of an exciting way. So I'm excited about that. Currently, weather could be modeled as an individual risk. We're going a step further and allowing weather modeling in its own right with its own capabilities. Saving the mitigated schedule, then open in Primavera, yes, both Primavera and MS Project. And can it read the 8.2 version of P6? I'm not familiar with all the individual versions of P6, but I believe we're compatible with the most up-to-date version of Primavera. And if you send us an email, I'll double check that for you and get back to you. Let me put that email address back up on the screen. I always feel like I'm doing a kind of a radio call-in show when I go through the question and answers. Let's get back over to PowerPoint here. Here's that email address. No question too small. And I'll see your questions and I'll answer them as they come in. If they go beyond my knowledge, I'll get the development resources and whatever's needed to be able to answer your question. So thank you very much, everyone. Take advantage of our resources. We have a great risk white paper by Dr. David Hewlett that's out on our website. We offer software trial of all the different packages in our suite, which get you through that S1 through S5. If you're into social media, we're out there on Twitter. And of course, if If all else fails and you still have a question, whether or not you've looked at those other resources, please send us an email to info@projectacumen.com. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks very much.
The organizer has ended this